They sent him supermodels, heiresses, the daughters of senators and crime lords, women who could stop traffic in 3 countries and start wars with a single smile. Every single one of them failed. Adriano Moretti, the most feared man in New York, looked through every last one of them like they were made of glass. For 10 years, nobody could explain it. Then one rainy Tuesday morning, a girl in a gray uniform started singing while she cleaned his windows, and the man who had survived 17 assassination attempts stopped breathing. If you've ever been overlooked by someone you wanted to impress, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain came in sideways that morning, the kind that didn't fall so much as it attacked, driving hard against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moretti estate like it had a personal grievance with the glass. Inside, the marble floors were cold enough that even sound seemed to slow down before it traveled anywhere. The mansion sat on 11 acres of manicured property in Westchester County, 40 minutes north of Manhattan, surrounded by stone walls that were thick enough to muffle the occasional gunshot and tall enough to make a man feel like he owned something that mattered. Adriano Moretti stood at the window of his study on the second floor and watched the rain destroy his gardener's morning work without any particular feeling about it one way or the other. He was 38 years old. He had the jaw of someone who'd been punched in it before and the eyes of someone who hadn't been surprised by anything in a very long time. His coffee was going cold on the desk behind him. He knew it. He didn't care. Downstairs, he could hear the faint sound of heels on marble. Bianca. He didn't turn around. She knocked twice on the open door. A performance more than a courtesy, because Bianca DeLuca didn't actually ask permission to enter any room she'd already decided to enter. She was 29 years old, the only daughter of Carlo DeLuca, whose name still made certain lawyers go pale even in retirement. She was also, on paper, Adriano's fiancée. Had been for 14 months. Long enough that the wedding planners had already designed 4 separate table arrangements, and the florist had begun making suggestions Adriano had stopped reading after the first paragraph. "You didn't come to dinner last night," she said. "I ate." "That's not what I said." He turned from the window. She was wearing cream-colored silk and a look that had been carefully constructed to appear casual. Her dark hair was perfect. Her posture was perfect. Everything about Bianca DeLuca was arranged and considered and deliberate, down to the angle at which she held her chin when she wanted to signal that she was being patient with someone less intelligent than herself. She was by every measurable standard extraordinarily beautiful. Adriano looked at her the way a man looks at a painting he's seen too many times in the same hallway. "I have a meeting at 9, he said. "You always have a meeting at 9. "Then you know what time it is." Bianca's jaw tightened just slightly, a crack in the performance. She crossed the room and picked up his coffee cup, turned it in her hands like she was deciding something, and set it back down without drinking from it. "My father is asking about the ceremony date again. He wants something confirmed before the Castellano summit next month." "Tell your father I'll call him. I've been telling him that for 6 weeks." "Then tell him something different this time." Adriano picked up the folder on his desk and opened it. Discussion over. He didn't look up again. He heard her exhale through her nose, short, controlled, the sound of a woman who had learned very early in life that visible anger was a vulnerability. He heard her heels on the floor again. He heard the door close, not quite a slam, but not far from one either. He went back to the rain. The meeting at 9 was with his consigliere, a 61-year-old man named Sal Benedetti, who had the face of someone who'd eaten a lifetime of bad news and developed a taste for it. Sal sat across the desk in a chair that had belonged to Adriano's father and spread 4 photographs across the mahogany surface without preamble. "Caruso moved product through the Greenpoint terminal again," Sal said. "3rd time in 8 weeks. He's not being subtle about it." "He's not trying to be subtle. He's testing the fence." "So what do we do about it?" Adriano studied the photographs. Surveillance shots, grainy and slightly overexposed, showing a cargo operation that should not have been operating within 60 miles of Moretti territory. Lucien Caruso was 54 years old and had spent the last decade building something patient and systematic, while the older families spent their energy on old grievances. He was the kind of enemy that didn't announce himself until it was already too late to do the math correctly. "We document," Adriano said. "We don't move yet. The captains want—" "I know what the captains want." He pushed one of the photographs back across the desk. "What the captains want gets men killed. We document. We wait. We understand exactly what he's building before we decide what needs to come down." Sal folded his hands. He'd known Adriano since the boy was 14 years old, had watched him grow into something that even Sal sometimes had difficulty reading completely, which was, he supposed, the point. "Castellano's summit is next month. I'm aware. You'll need to bring Bianca." "I'm aware of that too." Sal was quiet for a moment. "She's a good match, Adriano. Her father's network alone." "Sal." One word, flat as a wall. The older man stopped talking. Adriano closed the folder. "Is there anything else?" The housekeeping agency had sent 3 new staff members to the estate that week. Adriano's head of household, a rigid woman named Mrs. Ferrante, who had managed the property for 11 years and ran it with the emotional warmth of a building inspector, had conducted the orientation herself on Monday morning. By Tuesday, 2 of the 3 had already been assigned to the West Wing and the guest quarters, respectively. The third was named Elena Viscari. She was 26 years old and had been doing housekeeping work since she was 19, first in hotel chains and then through private agencies, moving through a series of short-term contracts that paid steadily enough to keep her father's medication covered, and her younger sister in the community college program she'd enrolled in during the fall. Elena was not remarkable to look at in the way that tended to get people noticed in places like the Moretti estate. She was slight, maybe 5'4", with brown hair pulled back under a plain clip, brown eyes that she kept directed at whatever surface she was currently cleaning, and hands that were already developing the early calluses of someone who'd been working with them since before they should have been. She did not smile at the wrong moments. She did not ask questions she wasn't invited to ask. She apologized frequently and genuinely, rather than performatively, which made her apologies land differently than most people's. Mrs. Ferrante had assigned her to the East Corridor, a long stretch of the mansion's ground floor that included the main gallery, 3 sitting rooms that nobody sat in, and a series of tall windows that overlooked the rear garden. The windows were Adriano's grandmother's original choice, imported from somewhere in northern Italy decades ago, and they required specific cleaning solutions that Mrs. Ferrante had written out in careful detail on the instruction sheet she'd pressed into Elena's hand Monday morning. Elena had read the sheet twice and memorized it. She was working on the 4th window when it happened. It wasn't a conscious decision. That was the part that would be important later, the part that Adriano would turn over in his mind many times afterward, because he had spent his entire adult life in a world where everything was calculated and positioned and offered with intention, and what he heard coming through the corridor that Tuesday morning had none of that quality at all. She was just singing. Not loudly. Barely above her breath, really, the kind of sound a person makes when they're alone inside their own head and don't realize they've let something out. A melody, slow and minor-keyed, with words that curled at the edges like old paper. The language was Sicilian dialect, deep regional, the kind spoken in villages that had stopped using it long before Elena Vescari was born, and the melody itself moved in a way that suggested it had not been composed so much as accumulated, passed between people over generations until it wore smooth. Adriano had stopped at the entrance to the corridor. He did not know, in that first moment, why his feet had stopped moving. He stood there in the doorway in his gray suit with his phone in his hand and his 9 o'clock meeting already concluded and his 11 o'clock already building in the back of his mind, and he simply stood there while the music moved through the cold marble air toward him. The girl with her back to him was pulling the cleaning cloth along the lower frame of the window in slow, even strokes, and she was singing quietly to herself, and she had absolutely no idea he was there. Something moved in Adriano Moretti's chest that he did not have a name for. It was not attraction, not exactly. It was older than that. It was something closer to the feeling a person gets when they smell something that belonged to a place they loved before they understood what loving a place meant. It was the sensation of a door opening in a hallway they'd been certain contained only walls, because he knew that melody. His grandmother used to hum it. Nonna Lucia, who had died when he was 19 and left behind a specific quality of silence that no room in his life had ever been able to fill. She'd hum it while she cooked, while she sat by the window in the evenings with her mending in her lap, while she braided the hair of the girls in the neighborhood who came to her kitchen after school. She'd never explained it to anyone. He'd never thought to ask. He hadn't heard it since the day she died. Elena reached the corner of the window frame and stopped singing, suddenly and without drama, the way people stop when some small instinct in them finally surfaces and says, "You are not alone in this room." She turned her head. She found him standing in the doorway. The cloth dropped from her hand. She caught it before it hit the floor, which said something about her reflexes, and also about how often she'd been startled in professional settings. She straightened. Her chin came up. "I'm sorry, Ed," she said immediately. Her voice was different when she spoke. Ordinary. A little roughened at the edges, with the faint undertone of a borough accent she'd never quite lost. "I didn't know anyone was... I should have..." She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I apologize. I'll be quiet." Adriano looked at her. She looked back at him. She didn't know who he was. That was obvious from the way she was looking at him. Not with performance or calculation, not with the particular kind of awareness that women in this house usually carried when they were in a room with him. She was looking at him like a person looks at an obstacle they've appeared and need to navigate around. He could feel his phone in his hand and the 11 o'clock building and the Caruso photographs still arranged in his memory, and all of it felt, for about 4 seconds, like it was happening somewhere else. "What was that?" he said. She blinked. "Sir?" "The song." A pause. She looked genuinely uncertain whether she was in trouble for this. "I don't know the name of it. I've heard it since I was young, from my father." Another pause. "I'm sorry. I'll be..." "Sing it again." The words came out before he'd made a decision about them. Elena Vescari stared at him. This strange man in a gray suit standing in the doorway of an empty corridor, asking her to sing. He wasn't asking the way men in houses like this sometimes made requests that were not actually requests. He was asking the way a person asks for a glass of water when they've been walking in heat longer than they realized. "I'm working," she said, which was not a no. But it wasn't a yes either. It was an honest statement delivered by someone who didn't know the social architecture of the room she was standing in. Adriano almost said, "I own this house." He almost said, "I'm telling you to." He almost reached for the part of himself that had been negotiating by leverage for 20 years. He didn't. "5 minutes," he said instead. "Then I'll be out of your way." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her cloth, turned back to the window, and began to sing. He stood in that doorway for 11 minutes. He did not count them. Someone on his security detail would later pull the corridor camera footage for an unrelated reason and notice the timestamp, and nobody would say anything about it because nobody in Adriano Moretti's employ was in the business of commenting on things they didn't understand. When she finished, she didn't look at him again. She moved to the next window and began working. He left. He got halfway down the corridor before he stopped walking and stood there with his hand against the wall and his eyes on the floor, breathing carefully, the way he'd taught himself to breathe in rooms where he couldn't afford to let anyone see him affected by anything. Loyalty always hides beneath ordinary appearances. His grandmother's voice, exact and clear inside his memory, as if she'd spoken it directly into the morning air. He straightened up. He went to his 11 o'clock. But that evening, without explaining himself to anyone, he told Mrs. Ferrante that the East Corridor windows would need daily attention going forward, the new girl specifically. Schedule her there every morning. Mrs. Ferrante said she would arrange it. She asked no questions, because after 11 years she understood which decisions to respect without understanding. By the end of Elena's first week in the East Corridor, 3 things had happened that she would not fully understand the significance of until much later. The first was that Adriano had spoken to her on 4 separate mornings. Never long, never personal, always on the surface level of someone occupying the same space for practical reasons. Once to ask why she was using a different cloth than the one specified. She explained that the specified cloth left streaks on this particular glass in direct morning light, and she'd switched to a microfiber alternative she'd brought from her own supply kit. He'd looked at the window, nodded once, said nothing else. The second was that Bianca DeLuca had come through the corridor on Thursday afternoon while Elena was still working, looked at her the way people look at furniture they're deciding whether to redecorate around, and said nothing directly to her, but had said to someone on her phone while standing 6 feet away that the new help was remarkably plain for this neighborhood, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as it needed to. Elena had kept her eyes on the window. The third was that on Friday morning, when she arrived at the East Corridor at 7:30, there was a cup of coffee sitting on the windowsill at the end of the hall. Black, still hot. No note, no explanation. Mrs. Ferrante, when Elena brought it to her thinking it had been left by mistake, told her to keep it. Elena took it back to the corridor and drank it looking out at the rain-soaked garden, and she thought about her father's medication refill that was due on Saturday and her sister's textbooks for the spring semester. And she did not wonder about the coffee too deeply, because wondering about things too deeply in other people's houses had a way of costing you the job. She went back to work. She did not sing that morning, but on Monday she did. And on Monday, Adriano Moretti came back to the doorway. This time he brought his coffee. He leaned against the frame and listened and didn't ask her to continue when she stopped because he'd noticed, somewhere between Tuesday and Monday, that asking her to continue made her self-conscious in a way that changed the quality of the sound. She sang more fully when she forgot he was there. So he worked on being quiet enough that she could forget. He was better at that than most people knew. It was on a Wednesday in the third week that Bianca found out. Not about the coffee, not about the mornings in the corridor. She found out because she came looking for Adriano at 9 a.m. to discuss the Castellano Summit seating arrangement and found the East Corridor instead of the study. And she stood in the far archway and watched her fiancé, the most feared man in New York, standing in a doorway listening to a maid in a gray uniform sing an old folk song to herself while she polished windows. Bianca DeLuca was many things. She was not stupid. She watched for approximately 90 seconds. Then she turned and walked away without making a sound, her silk hem moving against the marble floor like something being carefully folded away for later use. She went to her suite. She called her father. She didn't tell him what she'd seen. She asked him, instead, about a girl named Elena Vescari and whether he had anyone who could pull employment records from a mid-tier housekeeping agency without leaving a digital trail. He said he'd have something by Friday. She said that would be fine. Then she hung up and sat by her window and looked at the rain and felt, for the first time in 14 months, the specific fear of a woman who has arranged her entire future around a man she has never actually reached. She didn't know the song. She didn't know the bloodline attached to it. She didn't know what she'd just set in motion. But she knew, in the way people know things that haven't yet become facts, that the girl in the gray uniform was going to be a problem. And Bianca DeLuca did not leave problems unaddressed. She never had. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the garden. Inside the East Corridor, the last notes of the old Sicilian melody faded into the cold marble air. And somewhere in the mansion's security room, a timestamp recorded Adriano Moretti still standing in the doorway, still listening, still breathing like a man who had just remembered something he didn't know he'd lost. The Friday that Bianca had been waiting for arrived cold and overcast, the kind of morning where the light never quite commits to being light. Carlo DeLuca's man had delivered what she asked for. A thin manila envelope slid under her suite door sometime before 6 a.m., the way certain kinds of information prefer to travel. No fingerprints on the outside, no return address on anything inside. Bianca sat at her vanity and read through Elena Vescari's employment history with her coffee going cold beside her and her face showing nothing in the mirror that she didn't intend it to show. Elena had worked 8 different housekeeping contracts in 7 years. Hotel chains first, mid-range, the kind of places that laundered sheets 400 times before retiring them. Then private homes, mostly through the same agency. The references on each contract cleaner than the last. No infractions. No complaints. One commendation from a property in Greenwich whose owner had written, in handwriting that suggested someone older and genuinely meant it, that Elena had more integrity than most people I pay twice her rate. The file included her current address, a two-bedroom apartment in the Fordham section of the Bronx she shared with her father, Matteo Vescari, 61 years old, receiving treatment for a heart condition that had required 2 hospitalizations in the last 3 years. One younger sister, Julia, 22, enrolled at Bronx Community College. Bianca set the last page down. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. There was nothing in the file she could use directly. That was the problem. The girl was clean in all the ways that made a person difficult to move. No debt she couldn't explain, no associations that raised questions, no gap in the record where something could be inserted without it looking exactly like what it was. She would have to build something. Bianca was patient. She'd learned patience the same way she'd learned everything useful, by watching her father operate in rooms where everyone else thought they were the smartest person present. She folded the envelope closed and put it in the back of her vanity drawer, under a silk scarf she hadn't worn in 6 months. Then she finished getting dressed. Adriano noticed something different about the East Corridor on Friday morning, but couldn't identify what it was for approximately 4 minutes, which was longer than it usually took him to identify what was different about any room he entered. He was standing in the doorway with his coffee, a habit that had established itself so quietly he hadn't noticed until it was already a habit, and looking at Elena working on the far windows, and the sound was there, the melody moving low and steady through the cold air, and everything appeared the same. Then he realized she'd closed the door to the adjoining sitting room. It was always open. She propped it with a small rubber wedge she carried in her supply kit, because the cross-ventilation helped the glass dry faster. She'd told him this on the second Tuesday, matter-of-factly, as though she was filing a report rather than making conversation. Today it was closed. He looked at it. He looked at her. She hadn't turned around. "Something wrong with the ventilation?" he said. She stopped singing. "No, sir." Her voice was slightly lower than usual, and she kept her back to him, which she occasionally did, but not quite like this. Not with this particular quality of deliberateness. "I just thought less draft today." He didn't push it. He drank his coffee. She went back to the glass. But when he left the corridor, he took a different route back to his study than usual, the one that ran along the outside of the building past the East Wing service entrance. Through the narrow window at the corridor's end, he could see the camera mount on the exterior wall, the one covering the service entrance. Covering, technically. The small red indicator light that should have been solid was blinking at irregular intervals, which meant the feed was interrupted, which meant someone had accessed the maintenance panel and adjusted the recording schedule without filing a work order. Adriano stood outside in the cold with his coffee and looked at the blinking light and felt something shift in the architecture of his thinking. Not alarm, exactly. Something quieter and more uncomfortable than alarm. The feeling of a pattern beginning to clarify before you have enough data points to be certain of its shape. He went inside and called his head of security, Marco Vitti, from his private line. "The East Service camera," he said. A pause. "Yeah, I saw that. Maintenance logged it as a routine calibration." "Who signed the work order?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'll find out." "Before lunch," Adriano said and hung up. The signed work order turned out not to exist. Marco brought this information to Adriano's study at 11:47 and delivered it with the expression of a man who had been doing this job for 9 years and had developed the specific emotional vocabulary of someone who regularly discovered things he wished he hadn't. Somebody accessed the panel directly. The calibration was manual, no electronic log, no badge swipe, nothing on camera because the camera was already interrupted when they did it. Which means they interrupted it first. Yes. Which means they knew where the panel was. That or they found it. Marco shifted his weight. Could be a lot of things. "Could be," Adriano said. He was looking at the window, not at Marco. The rain had stopped sometime around mid-morning and left everything outside looking scrubbed and slightly raw. Pull every badge entry in the East Wing for the last 3 days. Everyone. Staff, contractors, family members, guests. Marco said he would. Adriano said, "Don't tell Ferrante yet." Marco didn't ask why. Sit Yorm. Elena found the watch on Thursday of the following week. She was cleaning the small sitting room adjacent to the gallery. the room that connected to the east corridor, the one she usually propped open. And she was pulling the antique side table away from the wall to clean behind it, which was one of those tasks the instruction sheet didn't specify, but that Elena did anyway because she'd been taught early that the difference between a good job and a job worth calling good was whether you cleaned the parts no one would ever check. The watch was behind the table, wedged between the baseboard and the wall, and it had clearly been placed there rather than dropped. The chain was folded neatly beneath it, deliberately arranged. It was a woman's watch, gold, small face, with a bracelet that had the quiet weight of something real and expensive. On the back, engraved in script, BD and a date from several years ago. Elena looked at it for a long moment. She picked it up. She carried it directly to Mrs. Ferrante. Mrs. Ferrante took it from her with both hands and a look that was impossible to fully read, something between concern and the kind of calculation that a person does very fast when they want to appear uncalculating. "Where did you find this?" Elena told her. Specifically, the table, the gap, the deliberate fold of the chain. Mrs. Ferrante said she would handle it. She told Elena to go back to work. Elena went back to work. She did not find out until 2 days later, from a young footman named Daniel, who had loose professional boundaries and a tendency to share things he thought were interesting, that the watch belonged to Bianca De Luca, who had reported it missing from her suite approximately 4 days ago, and who had mentioned during that report that she'd last had it somewhere in the East Wing. Elena thought about the deliberately folded chain. She went very quiet inside herself. She went back to the East Corridor and she cleaned the windows, and she did not sing that morning. The accusation came on a Monday. It arrived in the form of Mrs. Ferrante appearing in the doorway of the East Corridor at 8:15 in the morning, with 2 of the household's senior staff behind her, and an expression so carefully composed that Elena knew before anyone said a word that something structural was about to change. "Elena." Pause. "Will you come with me, please?" Not a question. Elena set down her cloth. She followed. They took her to the small administrative office at the back of the household wing, a room that smelled like old invoices and the particular anxiety of people who manage other people. Ferrante sat. Elena stood. The 2 senior staff remained near the door in the way that people remain near doors when they've been positioned there, rather than arrived there naturally. Ferrante put a clear plastic bag on the desk between them. Inside it was an envelope. Inside the envelope, visible through the plastic, was a stack of cash, banded, uniform, the kind of uniform that suggested it had come from a deliberate source rather than been accumulated. "This was found in your locker this morning," Ferrante said. Elena looked at the envelope. She looked at Ferrante. "That's not mine. The locker has your combination. My combination that I've never given to anyone." Elena kept her voice even. It cost her something to keep it even. "How much is that?" Ferrante's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. $3,800. "Then if I was stealing from this house, I'm not very good at it." Elena took a breath, slow, steady. "I've been here less than a month. I don't know where anything valuable enough to generate that is kept. I don't know the security schedules. I clean windows." Another breath. "Someone put that there. That's a serious accusation. So is this one." The room was very quiet. The 2 staff members near the door looked at the wall. Ferrante picked up the bag and held it in both hands for a moment. She was not, Elena understood, a stupid woman. She was a woman operating inside a system that had just put something in front of her and asked her to respond to it, and she was measuring the cost of every available response in real time. "I'll need to report this upstairs." "Report it," Elena said. "Report all of it. Report where the locker is, who has access to the administrative wing, and when the money was found relative to my shift start time." She paused. "I got here at 7. My locker check-in is logged with the badge reader. If that money was there before 7, I'd like to know who put it there before I arrived." Ferrante looked at her for a long moment. "Wait here," she said. So, the report reached Adriano at 9:40 through Marco, not through Ferrante, because Marco had developed, over years of watching this particular household operate, a specific instinct for which information needed to reach Adriano before it had been processed by too many other people. Adriano listened without expression. He asked 3 questions. When was the cash found? What was the badge reader timestamp for Elena's morning entry? And who besides Elena and Ferrante had been in the administrative wing since 6 a.m.? Marco had answers to the first 2. Cash was flagged at 8. Her badge read 6:58. So the money was in the locker before she arrived. Unless she put it there before clocking in, without badging into the administrative wing? Marco said nothing. Adriano stood up from his desk. He moved to the window, the one overlooking the main driveway, and looked at the gray morning light on the gravel for a moment. Something was moving very cleanly through his thinking now, the way pieces move in a game when you suddenly see 3 moves further than you were seeing 60 seconds ago. The East Service camera, he said, still blinking. The watch that was found behind the table. Marco's eyes changed slightly. You think these are connected? I think someone is building a file, Adriano said. Carefully, one piece at a time. He turned from the window. Don't fire her. Ferrante is going to tell Ferrante I'm handling it personally. He picked up his phone from the desk. And pull every piece of security footage from the administrative wing going back 2 weeks. Every angle. Any interruption in that footage, even a second, I want the timestamp. And the cash? Log it as found property. Don't assign it to anyone yet. Marco nodded and left without asking any of the questions that were clearly collecting behind his eyes. Adriano stood in his study for a moment after the door closed. He was angry in the specific way he got angry when something was being operated against him in his own house, using his own systems, by someone who had calculated that he would either not notice or not care. The anger was cold and organizing rather than hot and reactive. He'd learned the difference early. The hot kind cost you. The cold kind paid you back with interest. He picked up his phone and looked at it and then set it down again. He was not yet ready to say Bianca's name out loud in the shape this situation was beginning to take. He needed more. He would get more. Elena was still in the administrative office when one of the junior staff knocked and told her Mrs. Ferrante said she could return to her duties. No further explanation, no resolution announced. Just, return to your duties. Elena walked back to the east corridor. She picked up her cloth. She stood in front of the window for a long time without cleaning it, looking at her own reflection in the glass, slightly distorted by the old-style manufacturing of the panes, the way antique glass always softens the image and makes a person look like they're being remembered rather than seen. She thought about her father's medication refill, about Julia's spring textbook list, which she'd reviewed on Sunday and estimated at $240 at minimum, even buying used. She thought about the envelope in the plastic bag and the way Ferrante had held it, and the 2 staff members positioned near the door like furniture that had been moved for a reason. She thought about the coffee that had appeared on the windowsill 3 weeks ago. She thought about a man in a gray suit standing in a doorway, asking her to sing like he was asking for water. She picked up her cloth and began cleaning the window. She did not sing, but her hands were steady. That was the part she held on to. Everything else could be frightening or uncertain, or designed by someone with more power than she had access to. But her hands were steady. Her father had taught her that steadiness under pressure was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to be useful anyway. She cleaned the window until the glass was clear. She moved to the next one. She was on the 3rd window when she heard footsteps in the corridor behind her. Not Ferrante's measured administrative gait, not the quick efficiency of the junior staff. These were slower, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who did not need to announce themselves by moving quickly because everyone in the building was already accounting for where they might be. She turned. Adriano stood in the doorway. He looked at her differently than he usually did. Not more intensely, exactly, but more directly. The way a man looks at something when he's decided to stop being careful about what his looking communicates. His coffee was not in his hand. His phone was not in his hand. His hands were at his sides, and he was simply standing there and looking at her. "You didn't do it," he said. Not a question. Elena held his gaze. "No, I didn't. I know." He said it simply, without drama, the way people state things they've already finished deciding. "I'm not going to fire you," she breathed, just once, slightly differently than before. "Okay. You should know." He stopped. He looked at the window she'd just cleaned, then back at her. Someone is making an argument about you, with planted evidence, in my house. I know, she said. Something moved behind his eyes. You're not surprised. I found the watch, she said. I thought about the chain. She paused. Someone arranged it to be found in that room, the same room you come to every morning. Another pause. I don't know why I specifically am the target. I've been here less than a month. The way she said it, plainly, without accusation directed at him, without any bid for his protection or his guilt, made something in Adriano's chest do the same thing it had done the first morning in the doorway. The door in the wall of all walls. He looked at her for a long moment. Do you want to leave? He said. I'll pay you 3 months. You can walk out today and none of this follows you. Elena turned back to the window. She picked up her cloth. I need the work, she said. My father's medication is expensive. My sister has 2 semesters left. She drew the cloth across the glass in a slow, even stroke. And I haven't done anything wrong. She said the last sentence the way someone says something they've been carrying for a long time and are tired of carrying alone. Not angry, not pleading, just true. Adriano stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said quietly enough that it barely reached her across the corridor. Neither have I. He left, and Elena stood with her cloth against the cold glass and her reflection looking back at her from the distorted antique surface, and she thought about what he'd said, neither have I, and understood, in the slow accumulating way she understood most things, that he hadn't been talking about the planted money. He'd been talking about something older, something that had been arranged against him long before she arrived in this house. She didn't know yet what it was, but she felt it the same way she felt the cold coming through old glass. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the steady pressure of something that had been building on the other side of the surface for a very long time and was now close enough to touch. 3 days later, Marco brought Adriano the security footage from the administrative wing. There was a 90-second gap on Tuesday evening, beginning at 9:14 p.m. 9:14 p.m. was 46 minutes after the East Wing security camera had logged its last stable frame before beginning its irregular blink. The badge record for the administrative wing showed no entries during that window, which meant whoever had been in there had gotten through a door that either wasn't locked or had been unlocked for them by someone who had the authority to unlock it. Adriano looked at the timestamps for a long time. Then he looked at his phone. Then he put the phone face down on the desk. He was not ready yet. He needed one more thing. One piece that would move this from architecture into fact. He called Marco back in. The Castellano Summit, he said. Bianca confirmed her attendance 2 weeks ago. Yes. Pull her itinerary. Everything she's done outside this property in the last 30 days. Every meeting, every call she made from the landlines here, every visitor she received. He paused. Quietly. Nobody knows you're pulling it. Not Ferrante, not Bianca's staff, nobody. Marco's face was completely still. That's... He stopped. I know what it is, Adriano said. Marco left. Adriano sat in his chair and looked at the wall and felt the particular loneliness of a man who is beginning to understand that the person sleeping down the hall from him has been operating in a direction he cannot yet fully see, and that the most dangerous thing in his house is not outside the gate. And down the hall in the east corridor, Elena Viscari finished the last window of the day and packed her supply kit and walked to the service exit and caught the bus back to the Bronx, carrying nothing with her from the Moretti estate except the steady hands her father had given her, and the old melody still turning quietly in the back of her mind like something that did not yet know its own importance. She did not know that Bianca De Luca had already made a phone call that afternoon from a private number to a man named Lucien Caruso. She did not know what had been offered in that call, or what had been accepted. She did not know that by the time she returned to the estate the next morning, she would no longer be a problem someone was building a file against. She would be a target. The call that Bianca made to Lucien Caruso lasted 11 minutes and 23 seconds, according to the phone record that Marco laid on Adriano's desk the following Tuesday morning. The record had come from the estate's landline routing system, an internal log that Bianca's people apparently hadn't known existed or had underestimated, which told Adriano something important about how carefully she'd actually thought this through versus how carefully she believed she had. Marco stood across the desk and said nothing while Adriano read the log. The call had been placed from the private line in Bianca's suite at 4:17 p.m., approximately 2 hours after Adriano had told Marco to pull her itinerary, which meant either she'd made the call before knowing she was being watched, or she'd made it because she knew and had decided to accelerate whatever she was building. Adriano was not yet certain which one it was, and the difference mattered. "Did we get content?" he said. "No. The routing log captures numbers and duration, not audio." Caruso's number. "Registered to a shell out of Delaware, third layer in, but the call bounced through a relay we've seen before." Marco paused. "Twice in the last 18 months, both times right before something happened near our territory that we couldn't source." Adriano set the paper down. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. An old habit, something he'd started doing at 14 when he needed to think, without his face giving anything away to whatever room he was in. "She's been talking to him before," he said. It was not a question. "That's what the relay pattern suggests." "For 18 months, at minimum." The room was very quiet. Outside, the morning had decided to be cold and clear, the kind of November day that looked warm through glass until you stepped into it. Adriano looked at the ceiling and breathed and let himself understand the full geometry of what he was looking at. 14 months of engagement, 18 months of contact with Caruso, which meant the contact had started 4 months before Bianca accepted his ring, which meant the ring was not the beginning of something. It was a position inside something that had already begun. He lowered his gaze. He picked up the paper again and looked at the duration. 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Long enough to have a real conversation, long enough to make arrangements. "Where is she now?" he said. "Dining room. Breakfast." Adriano stood up. Bianca was eating alone at the far end of the long dining table, which could seat 26 and usually sat empty at this hour. She had a small plate of fruit and a cup of espresso and a magazine open beside her plate that she wasn't reading. She looked up when Adriano came in, and her expression did the thing it always did when he arrived without announcement. It arranged itself quickly, a half-second reorganization that most people wouldn't catch, but that Adriano had been watching for months. He sat down across from her without preamble. He put the phone record on the table between them. She looked at it. Her eyes moved across it at a controlled speed. Not fast, which would have suggested panic, not slow, which would have suggested she was buying time. She was calibrating, and she was good at it, and under different circumstances, Adriano might have respected it. "When did you start talking to Caruso?" he said. Her eyes came up to his. "I don't know what that is." "The number, the relay, the timing." He touched the paper once with one finger. "I need you to understand that I'm not asking because I'm uncertain. I'm asking because the answer changes what happens next." A long pause. She reached for her espresso and drank from it, a small, deliberate act of normalcy in a conversation that had stopped being normal the moment he sat down. "Business connections overlap, Adriano. My father has relationships with—" "Your father doesn't use that relay." She set the cup down. 4 times, Adriano said. 4 contacts through that relay in 18 months. The first one was 3 weeks before you came to dinner at my house with your father, and we discussed the arrangement. He watched her face. "You sat across from me at this same table. You smiled at exactly the right moments. You knew which wine I preferred." He paused. "You'd done your homework." "Every woman does her homework." "Not for Lucien Caruso." The name landed in the space between them, and neither of them moved. Bianca's hands were flat on the table, one on each side of her plate, and her posture was precise and her chin was level. And she looked in that moment exactly like what she was, a woman who had been trained since childhood to remain composed inside situations that were designed to make people lose their composure. "You don't have audio," she said. "No. You have a number and a duration. And a pattern. A pattern is not a confession. I'm not in a courtroom. Adriano said quietly. She looked at him. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but the recalibration of someone who has just updated their estimate of a situation. What do you want? I want to know what you offered him. I haven't offered anyone anything. Bianca. He said her name without inflection, without anger, and that was somehow worse than either. There's a woman on my staff who's been set up twice in 3 weeks. A camera that somebody tampered with. A work order that doesn't exist. Cash in a locker that the badge log says she was nowhere near. He leaned forward slightly. Someone built that. Someone who knows this property well enough to know where the maintenance panels are and which lockers belong to which staff and how to get into the administrative wing without a badge entry. He paused. That's not an outside job. The dining room was completely silent, except for the faint sound of the kitchen behind its closed door. Bianca picked up her magazine, looked at the cover for 1 second, and set it back down. You've been spending a great deal of time in the East Corridor, she said. Her voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, but stripped of something. The performance layer coming off. A maid, Adriano. A girl who cleans your windows. Don't. She sings an old song and you stop eating. You move her schedule, you bring her coffee. The edge in her voice was not jealousy exactly. It was the specific fury of someone who has invested a precise and enormous amount of themselves into a position and is watching that investment be devalued by something they cannot understand or compete with. She's no one. She hasn't done anything to you. She exists in a space that belonged to someone else. Bianca stood up. She moved around the table, not toward him, but to the window, where she stood with her back to him and her arms crossed and her reflection ghosting in the glass. My father spent 2 years building this arrangement. 2 years. And you spend more genuine conversation with a girl from the Bronx in 3 weeks than you've spent with me in 14 months. She turned. What exactly am I supposed to do with that? You're supposed to not call Lucian Caruso. She laughed, a short, hollow sound. Is that what you think this is about? Jealousy? She shook her head. I'm a DeLuca. I don't act out of jealousy. I act out of calculation. She stopped. I called Caruso because the arrangement between our families has been stalling for 1.5 years, and my father needs the Castellano summit to go a specific way, and I was managing variables. What variables? She looked at him directly. You. The words sat in the room like something dropped from a height. Adriano stood up slowly. Explain that. You've been pulling back for 8 months. From the organization, from the families, from me. Everyone sees it. Your captains are restless. The Castellano people are asking my father whether the Moretti seat is going to be stable through the next decade. And she stopped, breathed. I was managing it, keeping the alliance credible while you, she gestured vaguely at the direction of the East Corridor, found something more interesting to do with your mornings. By going to Caruso. By maintaining a channel that kept our options open if you decided to. What did you offer him? Adriano's voice had dropped to something very quiet and very flat. Not the alliance politics, not the positioning. What did you specifically offer Lucian Caruso in exchange for whatever he's agreed to do? Bianca looked at him for a long moment. She said nothing. And in that silence, Adriano understood, with the cold organizational clarity that had kept him alive through things that had killed other men, that she had offered Caruso something she was not willing to say out loud in front of him, which meant she had offered him something she knew he could not absorb without it changing everything between them in a way that couldn't be reversed. He walked to the door. Don't leave the property, he said. He didn't look back. He found Marco in the security room 20 minutes later and said 4 words. Lock the east wing. Marco looked up from his monitors. All of it? Every access point, new badge assignments, new codes, nobody in or out without my direct authorization. He moved to the monitor bank and looked at the camera feeds. The gallery, the corridor, the service entrance with its still blinking indicator. And get Elena Viscari up here before her shift starts. Don't send someone who'll scare her. Go yourself. Marco was already reaching for his radio. Yeah. Elena arrived in the security room 8 minutes later, still in her coat, her supply kit over one shoulder, her hair not yet clipped back for the day. She looked at the room, the monitors, the equipment, Marco stepping out and closing the door behind him, Adriano standing in the middle of it all, and she looked like a person running a very fast internal calculation about whether to be afraid. She decided, visibly, not to be. It was a decision rather than a feeling, which was one of the things Adriano had started noticing about her. She made decisions where other people had reactions. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I'm going to tell you some things," he said. "You don't have to say anything until I'm done." He pulled a chair from the desk and sat across from her, closer than their usual corridor distance, and he looked at her directly the way he'd looked at Bianca over the phone record 40 minutes ago. Except differently. Without the cold organizational anger. With something that was closer to the thing he'd felt in the doorway the first morning. "Someone in this house has been building a case against you. The watch, the money. There's more we haven't disclosed to you yet. A disciplinary file that was started without my authorization." Elena's jaw tightened. One small muscle along the left side. "Someone also made a phone call this week to a man named Lucien Caruso." He watched her face. "Do you know that name?" "No." "He's a—" Adriano paused. He looked at the monitor bank for a moment. "He's someone who operates in the same world I operate in. Someone who has reasons to want certain things to go a certain way at an event next month." He looked back at her. "I don't know what was offered in that call, but the pattern of what's been happening to you in this house and the timing of that call are not separate things." Elena looked at him. "You're saying someone offered me to him?" "I'm saying I think the plan was for you to be removed from this property under circumstances that made you look like a thief. And that removal was supposed to happen before you could—" He stopped. Before she could what? He didn't finish. He wasn't entirely sure of the ending yet. "Before I could what?" she said. "I don't know," he said, honestly. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were on her knees, flat, steady. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what's happening in a house you work in." "That's not the whole reason." He looked at her. "You could have moved me to another property," she said, "or sent me home with severance like you offered before. You didn't have to brief me on the internal situation." She wasn't accusing, she was parsing, the way she parsed everything, carefully, without drama, looking for the accurate understanding rather than the comfortable one. "What do you need from me?" Adriano leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I need to know where you learned that song." The question clearly was not what she was expecting. She blinked. "My father." "Where did he learn it?" "From his mother. From her mother before that." She paused. "Why?" "Does your family have any connection to a name? Belandi?" The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Elena's face didn't go pale exactly. It went still, in the specific way that faces go still when a word arrives that carries weight the person has been carrying for a long time without knowing they were allowed to put it down. Her hands pressed slightly harder against her knees. Her breathing changed, not dramatically, just the subtle shift of someone who has been hit somewhere that doesn't show. "Where did you hear that name?" she said. "My grandmother," Adriano said. "She used to talk about a family, the Belandis. She said they were protectors, that they saved my grandfather's life during a war between the families decades ago, before I was born. She said they disappeared, that someone had—" He stopped. "That they were destroyed. All of them." Elena was very still. "She used to hum the same song you sing," Adriano said. "She said it was their oath, that only people from that bloodline carried it." He looked at Elena's face, at the stillness there. "She told me if I ever heard it again in my life, I should listen very carefully to who was singing." The security room hummed with the sound of its equipment. On one of the monitors, the East Corridor camera showed the morning light beginning to reach the windows that Elena hadn't yet cleaned. "My grandfather's name was Matteo Belandi," Elena said. Her voice was very quiet and completely steady, the way voices go steady when the alternative is falling apart, and falling apart is not an option. "He changed our name when they fled. When it happened." She stopped. My father doesn't talk about it. He told me the song when I was small. He said it was the only thing we could carry without anyone knowing what it was. Adriano did not move. My father, Elena said. His heart condition, the hospitalizations. She looked directly at Adriano. 3 years ago, a man came to our apartment. I wasn't there. My father told me about it afterward. He said the man asked questions about our family history, about our grandfather's name, about any documents we might have. Her jaw tightened again. My father had a heart attack 4 days later, his first one. The cold that moved through Adriano then was not the cold of the room. Who was the man? He said. My father didn't know his name. He described him. She paused. I think, based on what you just told me about phone calls and patterns, I think I might know who sent him. Adriano stood up. He moved to the monitor bank and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the camera feeds without seeing them. The architecture that had been clarifying in his thinking for 2 weeks was now fully visible, and it was not the shape he had been building toward. It was larger. It went back further. It had been operating in directions he hadn't been looking. Bianca had not simply been managing variables. She had known what Elena was before Elena arrived at this estate, had possibly known for 3 years, had possibly been the reason Elena's family had been asked questions that sent an old man into cardiac arrest, which meant the housekeeping agency placement was not random, which meant Elena had not stumbled into this house. She had been delivered to it by someone who needed her inside the walls for a reason that had nothing to do with clean windows. He turned around. Elena was watching him work through it. She was not asking questions because she was doing the same work herself, and she was close enough to the same answer that asking questions would only slow them both down. The agency, he said. I applied, she said, normally, through their website. Who referred you to that specific agency? A pause, a long one. A woman at my father's cardiologist's office. She said they placed reliable people in good households. Elena's voice remained steady, but her eyes had changed. They were doing the math now, the full terrible math of it. She said the pay was better than hotel work. Did you get her name? No, she breathed. She called the house. I wasn't home. My father took the message. Adriano crossed the room in 5 steps and opened the door. Marco was in the hallway, as Adriano knew he would be. Marco had a talent for being exactly where he needed to be in situations that were moving fast. I need Caruso's known associates, Adriano said. Anyone connected to a cardiologist's office in the Bronx 3 years back. And I need it before the afternoon. He paused. And I need someone on Elena's father right now, somebody we trust. He doesn't leave the apartment alone. He doesn't open the door to anyone we haven't cleared. And if anyone so much as parks outside his building twice in the same week, I want to know. Marco was already on his phone. Adriano went back inside. Elena was standing now, her supply kit on the floor beside the chair, her coat still on. She looked at him across the small room, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked like what she actually was. A 26-year-old woman from the Bronx who had just discovered that her life for the last 3 years had been an operation someone else was running, and that the song she'd learned at her grandmother's knee was not just a memory, but a key that certain people had been waiting for her to produce. What do you need me to do? She said. He looked at her, the steadiness of her, the hands flat at her sides. Stay close, he said. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't tell anyone what we talked about in here. He paused. And don't stop singing. She looked at him like that last part required explanation. If whoever placed you here is monitoring this property, he said, and they see that you've stopped your routine, they'll know we've moved. We need them to think everything is still on schedule. He held her gaze. Can you do that? I've been doing that my whole life, she said, keeping my head down, looking ordinary. She reached for her supply kit. I'm very good at it. She walked past him to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, the same posture, almost exactly, as the one he used when he stood in the corridor doorway every morning. She didn't turn around. Mr. Moretti, she said. Adriano. A pause. Adriano. She said the name like she was testing the weight of it. If my father is in danger because of what I carry, because of who we are. She stopped, started again. How long has someone known? He didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was long enough that the timing of everything. The cardiologist referral, the agency placement, the accelerating move against Elena inside the estate, and Bianca's call to Caruso, suggested that someone had been waiting for exactly the right moment to bring all of it to a head simultaneously. The Castellano summit was 18 days away. Long enough? He said. She nodded once. She walked out. And Adriano stood in the security room surrounded by monitors and the hum of equipment and the weight of an 18-month conspiracy that had been built inside his own walls. And he understood that he had approximately 18 days to dismantle something that had been constructed with the specific advantage of knowing him. His habits, his schedule, his silence about Bianca, his mornings in the East Corridor, before it dismantled him. The summit would bring every major family leader within reach of whatever Caruso and Bianca had arranged. If they moved against Elena there, in public, in front of everyone, and framed it as a security breach, as an assassin placed inside the Moretti house by a rival syndicate, the fallout would be catastrophic and irreversible. The trust between the families would collapse. Adriano's authority would be called into question at the exact moment it needed to be strongest. And whatever Bianca had promised Caruso in exchange for his cooperation would be delivered in the chaos. Elena would not survive that chaos. He knew this the same way he knew all the things he knew about rooms where people didn't survive, from the pattern, from the architecture, from the 20 years he'd spent learning to see the shape of what was being built before it was finished. He went to his desk. He opened the drawer. He took out a notebook, physical, paper, the kind that couldn't be accessed or monitored or extracted through any system a person might have compromised. And he began to write down everything he knew in the order he knew it, building it from the relay log backward through 3 years to a phone call from a cardiologist's office to a Bronx apartment where an old man with a damaged heart had answered a stranger's questions about a family name that should have stayed buried. His pen moved steadily across the page. Outside, through the window of his study, he could see the East Corridor windows from this angle, faint, distant, the morning light catching the old glass. Inside one of those windows, a reflection was moving. Elena, working. And after a moment, barely audible through the stone walls and the distance and the cold morning air, he heard it. The melody. Old and minor keyed and completely unafraid. She was singing, and on the monitor in the security room that Marco had left running, the camera covering the estate's front gate showed a black car that had been parked on the road outside for 47 minutes. It pulled away before anyone could get a plate, but it had been there, and whoever was inside it had been watching the window where the reflection moved and listening, perhaps for exactly the sound that was now moving through the cold November air of the Moretti estate. Like something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard by the right person at the wrong moment. The black car came back the next morning. Different plates. Same make, same model, same 47-minute window of stillness on the road outside the front gate. Marco flagged it at 6:51 a.m. and had a man outside by 6:53. But the car was already gone, pulling away with the same deliberate patience it had arrived with. Not fast enough to suggest alarm, not slow enough to suggest carelessness. Just gone. Adriano looked at the surveillance still on Marco's tablet at 7:15 and felt the timeline compressing in his chest like a physical thing. 17 days to the summit, except whoever was in that car wasn't waiting for the summit anymore. They were counting something else. He went to his study and spread the notebook open on his desk alongside everything Marco had built in the last 48 hours. The cardiologist's office connection had come in overnight. A billing administrator named Renata Sasso, 44 years old, who had worked for the practice for 6 years before leaving abruptly 9 months ago. Her forwarding address was a street in Red Hook that turned out to be a parking garage. Her last documented employer after the practice was a logistics company registered in Delaware, whose registered agent was the same shell that held Caruso's relay number. 3 years of patience. The same relay. The same shell. Adriano pressed his palm flat on the notebook and looked at the wall and breathed. Caruso had known about the Belandi bloodline for at least 3 years, had located Matteo Vescari, had sent someone to ask questions, had apparently decided the old man either didn't know enough or wasn't the right move, and had then waited, had placed a contact inside a medical office, had waited for the right moment, the right arrangement, the right house for Elena to be placed in. His house, which meant Caruso had known about the Belandi connection to the Moretti family long before Adriano had known himself, which meant someone had told him. Adriano picked up his pen and wrote one word in the margin of the notebook. Who? He stared at it. Then he picked up his phone and called the one person he trusted with questions that didn't have answers yet. A 73-year-old man named Don Enzo Castellano, who had known Adriano's grandfather, who had attended Nonna Lucia's funeral, and who had the kind of memory that only developed in people who had survived long enough to understand that forgetting things was how men got killed. The phone rang 4 times. Adriano, the old man said. His voice was the voice of someone who had been awake for hours already, which at 73 and with everything he carried was simply the condition of being alive. Don Enzo. Adriano stood at his window. The front drive was empty, the gate closed, the road beyond it quiet and gray. I need to ask you something about a name. A pause. Ask. Belandi. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Adriano counted his own heartbeats. 5, 6, 7. Where did you hear that name? The old man said. From my grandmother, a long time ago, and now from someone who carries it. Adriano paused. Don Enzo, was there someone 30 years ago who wanted that family gone? Someone who benefited from their disappearance? Another silence. When Castellano spoke again, his voice had changed. It had the quality of something being unlocked from a place that hadn't been opened in a very long time. There was a man, he said slowly. He called himself a broker. He moved between the families without belonging to any of them. He came from... A pause. He came from somewhere in western Sicily, I think. He told people he was De Luca's man. But Carlo De Luca was young then, barely established. The broker was operating for someone else. Adriano's pen stopped moving. The Belandis had documents, Castellano continued. Records going back generations. They knew things about every family, who had betrayed who had built their territory on someone else's bloodshed. They held those records as a guarantee. As long as they held them, no one could move against them. The old man stopped. Someone decided the guarantee wasn't good enough. The broker arranged for the documents to be seized and the family to be removed. Who was the broker working for? We never knew. That was his particular talent. A sound on the line. Not quite a sigh, something heavier. What we knew was that after the Belandis were gone, one man's territory expanded faster than anyone had seen in 20 years. 3 families consolidated under his control inside of 4 months. Whose territory? The old man said a name. Adriano set his pen down. The name was not Caruso's. It was older than Caruso. It was the name of Caruso's father. Well, he had 40 minutes before Elena arrived for her shift. He used 35 of them in the security room with Marco, building a picture that moved from the notebook's margins into something operational and time-sensitive. The remaining 5 he used standing in the east corridor alone in the early morning quiet, looking at the windows Elena cleaned every day. The old glass threw his reflection back at him distorted, softened, the way antique glass always did. He looked at himself in it and tried to see what his grandmother might have seen. What she had tried to prepare him for with a song she hummed and never explained, with a name she spoke carefully and only once, with the particular way she had looked at him the last time he visited her before she died, as though she was trying to transfer something from herself to him that words were too small to carry. He thought he understood now. He heard Elena come in at 6:58, the soft sound of her supply kit on the floor, the specific rhythm of her footsteps. He didn't turn around. She didn't speak immediately either. She went to her kit and began her preparation, and for a moment the corridor held only the small sounds of morning routine, and it was almost possible to believe this was any other day. "There's a car," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw it from the bus stop Tuesday." Her voice was completely even. "I didn't know if I should tell you." He turned then. She was crouching by her kit, not looking at him, her hands sorting through the cleaning supplies with practiced efficiency. "You saw it Tuesday. And Wednesday. Different plates. She stood. In my neighborhood, you learn to notice cars that park without purpose. She met his eyes. Has Marco identified it? Not the occupants. We have the shell company the plates trace back to. He paused. It connects to Caruso. Then he's not waiting for your summit. No. She looked at him steadily. Under the gray housekeeping uniform, in the cold morning light of the corridor she'd cleaned every day for a month, she looked like what she actually was, not a maid, not a pawn, not a piece someone else was moving across a board. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy and hidden for a long time and had finally found a surface solid enough to set it down on. What do we do? She said. We change the board, Adriano said, before they make their move. The Castellano summit was scheduled for the Roosevelt Island facility, a venue that DeLuca had proposed 8 months earlier, and that everyone had agreed to without asking enough questions about why DeLuca specifically wanted it. Roosevelt Island meant a controlled environment. One bridge, one aerial tram, the river on both sides. The kind of location that felt secure to the families attending because it limited outside access. It also, Adriano now understood, limited the ability of anyone inside to leave quickly. He spent 6 hours on Thursday building an alternate plan with Marco and 2 men from his inner circle whose loyalty he had tested personally over years in situations that left no room for performance. They didn't use phones, they used the notebook and paper Marco brought in, and they talked quietly in the security room with the door locked, and when they were done, the paper went into the room's internal shredder. The core of the plan was simple. Don't wait for the summit. Force the confrontation on ground that Adriano chose. The mechanism was the archive. Adriano's grandmother had left things behind. He'd known this in the vague way people know things about deceased relatives that they haven't felt urgent enough to fully examine. Boxes in the estate's basement storage, personal items that Mrs. Ferrante cataloged when she arrived 11 years ago, and that Adriano had never opened because opening them would have required a kind of attention to grief that he hadn't known how to give. He told himself someday he would sit with them. He hadn't. On Thursday afternoon, he went down to the basement for the first time in years. The storage room was cold and smelled like old paper, and the particular stillness of things that have been untouched for a very long time. Mrs. Ferrante's catalog was precise. 12 boxes, organized by year, labeled in her handwriting, each one exactly where the record said it would be. He found the one marked with his grandmother's name and the year before she died. Inside, beneath folded fabric and a pair of reading glasses and the small accumulated objects of a life, was a journal. Dark cover, worn at the corners, the pages dense with his grandmother's handwriting in the close, careful script she used when she was recording something she wanted to be accurate. And beneath the journal, in a manila folder that had been wrapped in cloth and sealed with tape that had dried and cracked with age, was a collection of documents that had survived 30 years in a box in a basement. Adriano sat on the floor of the storage room in his good suit and read his grandmother's journal by the light of his phone until his legs were numb and the cold had worked its way into his shoulders. She had known. Not everything, but enough. She had known that the Belandi family's destruction had been arranged by someone inside the commission structure, that the records they held had been seized before they were killed, and that the copies, the ones the broker hadn't found, had been brought to her by a young man she described only as the boy who trusted us with his family's last obligation. The copies were in the folder. Adriano opened the folder with hands that were not quite steady. The documents were dense and old and in several cases damaged by time, but legible. Records in the Belandi family's precise bookkeeping style, cataloging transactions, arrangements, betrayals, and their architects, going back nearly 5 decades. The kind of records that could rewrite the history of a dozen families' territories in ways that would be catastrophic for anyone whose current power rested on the lies those records exposed, including, documented on the 4th page in handwriting that matched the style of every other entry, a record of the broker's arrangement, his name, his principal's name, the transaction that had ended the Belandi family, Caruso's father, and co-signing the authorization, a name that Adriano had seen at the top of a wedding guest list for 14 months, Carlo DeLuca. Not a young man operating at the edges, the architect. Adriano sat on the cold floor of the storage room and breathed very carefully for a long moment, the way he breathed in rooms where he couldn't afford to let anything show. Then he took photographs of every page with his phone. Then he went to find Elena. She was still in the corridor. Late afternoon light was coming through the windows now at the low winter angle that turned the old glass amber, and she was cleaning the last pane of the day, her movement slower than morning. The particular slowness of someone who has been at physical work for hours and is running on the last of their careful reserves. He came in and she heard him and turned before he reached her. She saw his face. "What did you find?" she said. He told her. Not everything. Not the full documentation, not the names in their specific legal weight, but the shape of it. The broker. The authorization. Carlo De Luca's name beside Caruso's father's name on a piece of paper that had been buried in his grandmother's storage for 30 years. Elena listened without moving. She stood with her cloth in one hand and the amber light on the side of her face, and she listened to the account of how her family had been ended. And she was very still in the way that people are still when they are holding something enormous that they cannot yet put down. When he finished, she turned back to the window. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. "My father knows," she said quietly. "He's always known. He just never knew who." She paused. "He made me memorize the song because he said it was the only evidence left that we existed." Her voice did not break. It went lower. "He said someday someone would recognize it, and that when they did, I'd know whether to run or stay." "What did you decide?" Adriano said. She looked at her palm against the glass for a long moment. "I decided to clean the window," she said. Adriano moved on Friday, not against Bianca directly, not yet, against the situation's architecture. He called Castellano from a clean line and told the old man what he'd found, not all of it, but enough. And Castellano was quiet for a long time and then said, in the voice of a man who had been waiting 30 years for a particular accounting to come due, "Send me the photographs." Adriano sent them. He also called 3 of the senior family leaders he trusted, men whose trust he'd built over years through consistency and through the specific quality of never asking them for anything he wasn't prepared to give back at equivalent cost. He told each of them, separately, that the Castellano Summit's Roosevelt Island location had been compromised and that he was proposing an alternate site. He told each of them that he had documentation relevant to every family present that they would want to see before any agreements were signed. He did not tell them what the documentation contained. He let them wonder. He knew how these men operated. Uncertainty about what you might not know was more compelling than certainty about what you already did. By Saturday morning, 3 out of 5 had confirmed attendance at the alternate location. The other 2 would hear about it from the 3. He hadn't told Bianca or Carlo De Luca about the change. He hadn't told Caruso. He was counting on all 3 of them finding out the way people found out things they weren't supposed to know. Through the same network of contacts and compromised loyalties that had made this entire operation possible. He was counting on them moving fast when they did. The call from Bianca came Saturday night at 11:40. She didn't say where she'd heard about the location change. She said, "You're making a mistake." "Tell me why," he said. "Because whatever you think you found..." She stopped. Started again. "My father is not your enemy. Whatever documents you're looking at, there's context you don't have." "Then give me the context. Not on the phone." "In person, then." A pause. "Yes." "Tomorrow morning," Adriano said. "Here. Dining room. 8 a.m. She said yes and hung up. Adriano put his phone down and looked at Marco across the security room. "She'll call her father tonight," Marco said. "Yes." "He'll call Caruso." "Yes." "And Caruso will..." "Move," Adriano said. "He'll stop waiting and he'll move." He looked at the monitor showing the front gate. "Which is what I need him to do." Marco looked at him. "You're using tomorrow's meeting as bait." "I'm using tomorrow's meeting as a clock," Adriano said. "Caruso has been careful for 18 months because he had time. As of tonight, he doesn't have time anymore. Careful men make mistakes when they lose their schedule." He paused. "Double the gate security. I want 2 men on Elena's building in the Bronx overnight. And get her father somewhere else tonight. Somewhere Caruso's people won't know to look." Marco started making calls. Adriano went to his study. He sat at his desk in the dark for a while without turning on any lights, the city glow coming through the window at a low amber angle that reminded him, without warning, and with a sharpness that moved through his chest like something physical, of the afternoon light in the east corridor falling across the old glass where Elena had pressed her palm. He thought about what she'd said. He made me memorize the song because he said it was the only evidence left that we existed. He thought about his grandmother humming the same melody in her kitchen, and the look she'd given him the last time he'd seen her, and the box in the storage room that he'd left unopened for years because grief required a quality of attention he hadn't known how to give. He'd been wrong about that, about waiting, about a lot of things he'd told himself there was still time for. He turned on the desk lamp and opened his notebook to a clean page. He wrote a letter, not to Bianca, not to DeLuca, not to anyone in the operational structure of what was coming in the next 12 hours. He wrote a letter to Elena's father in the formal and careful way his grandmother had taught him to write to people you owed something to, telling Matteo Viscari that his family's name was not forgotten, that the record of what they had done and what had been done to them was in hands that intended to give it the weight it deserved, and that his daughter was safe. He sealed it. He put it with the documents. At 3 a.m., his phone lit up with a call from the gate security captain. "Vehicle on the north perimeter," the captain said. "Not the road. The service access on the back property line." "How many?" "We count 4, maybe 5. "Armed?" "Definitely." Adriano was already on his feet. "Lock down the house. Everyone inside, no exceptions. Find Elena." "She's not here, sir. She went home at 5. The cold that moved through him then was different from any cold that had come before. It was the cold of a calculation you made correctly and still lost, because you forgot that the other side was also making calculations. They weren't coming for him. They had never been coming for him. "Get Marco," he said. "Get me a car. Now." He was running before he finished the sentence. Behind him, the estate's exterior lights flooded the grounds in white, illuminating the empty garden and the stone walls in the north perimeter, where 4 figures had already cleared the fence and were moving through the darkness toward the house that, in approximately 40 seconds, they were going to discover held no one worth taking. Because Caruso's people weren't there for the house. They were in the Bronx, and Adriano's car wasn't going to get there in time unless he drove it like the man he'd spent 20 years pretending he wasn't, not the organization's strategist, not the patient architectural thinker, not the man who moved only when he understood the complete geometry of a situation. Just a man, running, toward the sound of something he was afraid of losing before he'd had the chance to understand exactly how much it already meant to him. The gate opened, and the car hit the road at 70, and the city lights came up ahead like something burning, and in the back seat, Adriano held his phone and watched the location pin Marco had dropped on Elena's building and counted the minutes, and felt, for the first time in 20 years, something he had no operational name for moving through his chest, with a force that had nothing to do with strategy or territory or the cold organizational anger of a man protecting his assets. He pressed his palm flat against the car window the way she'd pressed hers against the glass. The city rushed past. The Bronx was loud at 3:40 in the morning in the specific way that certain neighborhoods never fully sleep. Not from life exactly, but from the accumulated noise of buildings packed too close together, radiators and traffic, and the distant sound of something always unresolved. Adriano's car came off the bridge hard, and Marco was on the phone with the 2 men stationed outside Elena's building, and for 40 seconds nobody said anything because the men outside weren't answering. Then one of them picked up. "We're okay," he said. He sounded like someone who had recently not been okay. "They came in from the alley side, 2 of them. We made them before they reached the entrance." "Elena," Adriano said. "Inside, we haven't been up. We didn't want to leave the entrance." "Go up," Adriano said. "Now. Don't knock. Use the passkey I gave you." He heard the man moving. He heard a door. He heard the particular sound of a small apartment at night, a television low somewhere, the creak of old flooring. Then silence. Then the man's voice again, quieter. "She's not here." Adriano's hand tightened on the phone until he felt the case flex. "Her father?" "Not here either. The apartment's empty. Looks like it's been empty for hours." He lowered the phone. He looked out the window at the street passing under the car and thought with the kind of cold, focused speed he could only access when everything else had been burned away by the specific fear that came from caring about an outcome more than about his own position in it. She'd known. She'd seen the car Tuesday. She'd watched it Wednesday. She'd told him matter-of-factly, in the East Corridor like she was filing a report. In my neighborhood, you learn to notice cars that park without purpose. She hadn't waited for someone to protect her. She'd moved her father herself. Marco, he said. Yeah. Call Daniel. Daniel, the young footman with loose professional boundaries who'd told Elena about the watch report. Adriano had not forgotten him. Had not forgotten that Elena had received that information through an informal channel, which meant she'd established a rapport with at least one person on the estate outside of her official interactions. People who established those rapports did so deliberately or instinctively. With Elena, Adriano suspected it was the latter, which made the network more real rather than less. Marco called Daniel. Daniel answered on the second ring, which meant he was awake, which meant he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of call, which meant Elena had prepared for it. Adriano took the phone. Where is she? A pause, then Daniel, very quietly. She made me promise. I know. Where is she? Another pause. The sound of someone deciding what kind of person they wanted to be at 3:40 in the morning with a man like Adriano Moretti on the other end of the phone. She said if you called, specifically you, not anyone else, she said to tell you the windows. Adriano was quiet for a moment. Then he said to his driver, the estate. Take the service entrance. She was in the East Corridor. He didn't know how she'd gotten back onto the property. He suspected Daniel had left the service gate unlatched, which was a security breach he would address later and not harshly, because the instinct behind it was sound. The corridor was dark except for the ambient light coming through the tall windows from the estate grounds outside, and Elena was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall beneath the third window from the end, her knees pulled up and her father beside her. Matteo Viscari, 61 years old, smaller than Adriano had imagined him, with the careful stillness of a man whose body had learned to conserve everything. Elena looked up when Adriano came through the door. She was not hurt. He checked for that first, in the quick involuntary inventory a person does when they've been afraid for someone. Her face, her hands, the way she was sitting. Nothing broken. Nothing bleeding. Just the exhaustion of someone who had been moving carefully through a dangerous night and had found the one place that felt solid enough to stop. He crossed the corridor and crouched in front of her father. Mr. Viscari, he said. The old man looked at him with eyes that were dark and careful and carried the specific quality of someone who had survived things by learning to read people very fast in the first seconds of meeting them. He looked at Adriano for a long moment. You're the one who heard her sing, he said. His voice was quiet and slightly rough, the voice of a man whose heart had been through things it shouldn't have had to go through. Yes, Adriano said. Matteo Viscari nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed that he'd been uncertain about for a long time. She told me. On the phone, when she came to get me. He paused. She said you found the documents. Yes. My father gave them to your grandmother, the old man said. Before it happened. He knew what was coming. He didn't know from which direction, but he knew. He told her. He told her the Morettis were the only family that had ever dealt with us in honesty. He said if anyone would hold the record correctly, it would be them. He stopped, breathed, carefully, with the deliberate quality of someone managing a damaged engine. She held it for 30 years. She was waiting for the right moment, Adriano said. She was waiting for you to be ready, the old man said. Adriano sat back on his heels and looked at Matteo Viscari and felt something move through him that he couldn't name and didn't try to. He looked at Elena. She was watching him with her hands still on her knees and her chin level and the same quality of steadiness that had been there the first morning in the doorway, the first time he'd heard her voice, the first time he'd understood that some things couldn't be performed and couldn't be arranged and couldn't be purchased. They just were. We need to move, he said. Both of you. There are rooms in the East Wing that have been locked for 11 years. Nobody knows they exist except Ferrante, And Ferrante is trustworthy in the ways that matter. He stood. Tonight you stay here. Tomorrow I need you both somewhere safer while I finish this. Elena stood. She reached down and helped her father up with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years, the specific grace of a daughter who had taken care of a parent long enough that the motion was completely without self-consciousness or performance. What happens tomorrow? She said. The summit, Adriano said, except not at Roosevelt Island. She looked at him. I'm going to give everyone in that room what they came for, he said. The truth about who built what on whose destruction. And I'm going to give them the choice of what to do with it. And Caruso? We'll be there. And Bianca? He paused. Yes. Elena looked at her father, and something passed between them in the way things pass between people who have been each other's entire world for long enough that whole conversations can happen in a glance. Then she looked back at Adriano. Okay, she said. The meeting that Adriano had called was not, in the end, a summit in any traditional sense. It took place at a property in Staten Island that belonged to Don Enzo Castellano and had the quality of a room where serious things had been said before, wood-paneled, heavy-furnished, with the particular stillness of spaces that had absorbed years of difficult conversations and held them in the walls. Castellano chaired it himself. That had been Adriano's request, and the old man had agreed without hesitation, which told Adriano that the photographs he'd sent had landed the way he'd needed them to land. The men in the room were Castellano himself, 4 senior family leaders whose names had appeared as witnesses on one or more of the Belandi documents, Lucien Caruso and Carlo De Luca. Bianca was not present. Adriano had told her that morning, in the dining room at 8 a.m. as arranged, with the documents spread on the table between them and the light coming in gray and cold through the windows, that her presence at the meeting was not going to be possible. He'd told her why. He'd watched her face as she read her father's name on the page, and he'd watched something in her architecture, the perfectly constructed composure, the arranged chin, the calibrated performance of 14 months, develop a crack that started at the eyes and moved outward. She hadn't spoken for a long time. Then she'd said very quietly, I didn't know what it was. What he'd done. I knew he had a relationship with Caruso. I didn't know where it started. I believe you, Adriano said. She looked at him. Do you? I believe you didn't know the origin, he said. I don't believe you didn't understand what you were doing when you called him. He paused. Those are 2 different things. I can hold both of them at the same time. She looked at the documents again, at her father's name, at the date, at the handwriting of a record keeper who had documented a transaction that had cost a family everything, in the same careful style that every other entry in the archive was written, because the Belandis had apparently believed that even the worst things deserved to be accurately recorded. What happens to my father? She said. That depends on the men in that room, Adriano said, and on what he says when he's in it. And to me? He looked at her across the table, at the face he'd looked at for 14 months and never quite reached, and that had never quite reached him. And that was now for the first time showing him something real. Not beauty, not strategy, not the careful arrangement of a woman managing her family's investment. Just a person, frightened and tired, sitting with the weight of something that had been built before she existed and handed to her without her full understanding of what she was carrying. You'll leave, he said. The engagement ends. You'll be provided for. I won't leave you without resources. That's not what this is. He paused. But you won't be in this house. You won't be in this world. You'll build something else. She was quiet for a long time. Is that mercy or punishment? She said. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe it's just the only honest thing I can offer you. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she nodded, once, in the precise way that people nod when they are accepting something they cannot change and choosing to carry it with whatever dignity they have left. She picked up her coffee cup. She set it down without drinking. She left the room. The Staten Island meeting lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Adriano had been in long rooms before with difficult men and high stakes, but this one had a quality he hadn't experienced in the same combination. The particular atmosphere of people being required to look at themselves clearly, which was different from and more uncomfortable than being required to look at each other. Castellano presented the documents without preamble. He read key sections aloud in the flat voice of a man reciting facts rather than making arguments, and the room was completely silent, in the way rooms go silent when the silence is the only available response to something that cannot be disputed. Carlo De Luca sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his face arranged in the careful blankness of a man who had been in rooms like this before and understood that the first person to speak after an accusation paid the largest cost. He waited. He was very good at waiting. Lucien Caruso was less good at it. "These documents are 30 years old," Caruso said. His voice was controlled, but his jaw was tight, and the tightness was doing more talking than the words. "Chain of custody is unbroken," Castellano said, "from Belandi to Lucia Moretti to her estate to her grandson." The old man looked at Caruso without expression. "I've had 2 people examine the paper and the ink. They are consistent with the period. The handwriting matches samples we already have." He folded his hands on the table. "Lucien, your father's name is on this paper." "My father is dead." "He is," Castellano said. "You're not." Caruso looked at him. Then he looked at Adriano. His eyes were the eyes of a man running calculations very fast and finding that the numbers weren't landing anywhere useful. "What do you want?" Caruso said to Adriano. "I want what's in this room to be the end of something," Adriano said. "Not a negotiation, not a restructuring, an end." He looked around the table, at the 4 senior leaders who had been witnesses, who had known or suspected or deliberately not examined what had happened 30 years ago. The Belandi family held records as a guarantee. Their presence was a check. When they were removed, the check was removed, and what happened afterward, the territory grabs, the consolidations, the 20 years of conflict that followed, that's the cost of what's documented here. He paused. "I'm not asking for blood. I'm asking for acknowledgement, for the record to be formally recognized by everyone in this room, and for the structures that were built on that foundation to be reformed rather than inherited." De Luca spoke for the first time. "That's a great deal to ask." "Less than what was taken," Adriano said. Silence. Then one of the senior leaders, a man named Ferrara, who had been in the life for 40 years and carried the particular weariness of someone who had outlived most of his original reasons, put both hands flat on the table and said, "I knew something was wrong with how it happened. 30 years ago, I told myself I didn't know what." He looked at De Luca. "I knew enough." De Luca looked at Ferrara, then at the table, then at his own hands. The silence in the room changed quality. It went from the silence of confrontation to the silence of something that had been standing for a long time, finally sitting down. Carlo De Luca was 67 years old. He had built something enormous on a foundation he'd helped destroy and had spent 3 decades not examining the ground underneath it. He looked in that moment like what he was. Not a powerful man, but an old one, tired, carrying something he'd never been able to put down because putting it down required saying what it was. He said it now, not an apology, something harder than an apology, an acknowledgement, clean and specific, and without the self-serving qualifications that apologies usually came with. He named what he'd done. He named Caruso's father's role. He acknowledged the record. It cost him something visible. The room could see it costing him. Caruso looked at his father's name in the document for a long time. Then he said, "What happens to me?" "That depends on what you do next," Adriano said, "not on what your father did." He looked at Caruso directly. "You've been building for 18 months on the assumption that you could use the Belandi bloodline as leverage to destabilize my position and expand into my territory during the transition chaos. You failed. But the infrastructure you built isn't inherently criminal in the same way your father's actions were." He paused. "I'm offering you a different calculation. Step back from Moretti territory. Support the commission restructuring. The record reflects your cooperation." Another pause. "Or don't. And the record reflects that too. All of it. To people well beyond this room." Caruso was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the November light was doing the thing it did in the late afternoon at that latitude, going gold and low and casting long shadows across everything so that the world looked briefly more significant than it usually managed. "All right," Caruso said. It was the most stripped-down thing Adriano had ever heard him say. No performance, no positioning, just a man accepting the boundaries of a situation he could no longer reshape. Adriano got back to the estate at 7:15 in the evening. The east corridor was quiet. Mrs. Ferrante had left the lights off in that wing, which she did by default in rooms not in use, and the corridor held only the last of the day's light coming through the tall windows in the long amber wash that Adriano had stopped thinking of as just light about 3 weeks into knowing Elena Viscari. He stood in the doorway. She was there, not cleaning, just sitting on the window seat at the far end of the corridor, the one built into the alcove of the largest window, with her father beside her and a blanket over his shoulders and a cup of something warm in her hands. They were talking quietly. He couldn't hear the words. He could hear the cadence, low, unhurried, the rhythm of two people who had been each other's whole world for long enough that they didn't need to perform for each other at all. He stood in the doorway and watched and did not announce himself. After a moment, without turning around, Elena said, "How did it go?" He stepped into the corridor. "It went." "That's not an answer. It's the honest one." He came closer. Her father looked up at him with those dark, careful eyes, and then looked back out the window at the grounds, which was either tact or the wisdom of a man who knew when to let a room breathe. De Luca acknowledged it. Caruso accepted terms. Castellano will formalize the record through the commission structure. He stopped. "It won't be clean. Things like this are never clean. There are people who'll resist the restructuring, and there'll be years of negotiating what it actually means on the ground." He looked at her. "But the foundation is different now. What it was built on has been named." Elena turned her cup in her hands. "My grandfather would have—" She stopped, started again. "My father says his father used to say that truth was the only currency that didn't devalue." She looked at the window, at the last of the amber light moving across the old glass. "I used to think that was just something people said." "You don't now." "I think it costs more than people expect," she said, "when you actually try to spend it." She looked at him. "What about Bianca?" "She's leaving," he said. "She didn't know the origin. She made choices I can't excuse, but they came from a place I understand. Being handed a position without being handed the full truth about what it was built on." He paused. "She'll have resources. She'll build something else." Elena was quiet for a moment. "That's more generous than she was to me." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him steadily. There was something in her face that wasn't quite a question, more like an observation being considered from multiple angles before it decided what it was. "Why?" she said. He thought about it, genuinely, rather than reaching for the answer that would land best. "Because I spent 20 years using the cold version of every decision," he said. "It kept me alive and it kept the organization intact, and it cost me something I didn't notice I was losing until I heard you sing in an empty corridor at 7:30 in the morning." He looked at the window, at their reflections in the old glass, slightly distorted, soft at the edges, like people being remembered rather than seen. "I don't want to make the cold version of this one." The corridor was very quiet. Matteo Viscari, without looking away from the window, reached over and put his hand on his daughter's knee. A small gesture. The gesture of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing and is simply acknowledging, quietly and without drama, that it has arrived. Elena looked down at her father's hand, then back at Adriano. "My contract with the agency ends in 2 weeks," she said. "I know. I wasn't planning to renew it." "I know that too. I was going to look for something closer to home, so my father doesn't have to be alone as much." She paused. "There's a music program at the community college where Julia goes. They need an accompanist and a vocal coach for the youth outreach sessions. It's not much money, but it's—" "Take it," he said. She looked at him. "Take it," he said again. "And if the money isn't enough—" He stopped. "That's not—" He stopped again. He breathed. "I'm not offering you money. I'm not offering you a position or a title or a seat at anything. He looked at her directly. I'm telling you that whatever you build from here, I'd like to know about it, how it goes, if it's going well, if it isn't. He paused. I'm not good at saying things like this without them sounding like transactions. I'm aware of that. Elena's mouth moved, almost a smile. Not quite. Something more honest than a smile and more durable. You're better at it than you think, she said. Her father made a small sound that might have been a laugh. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were not, in any version of the word, easy. The commission restructuring generated exactly the resistance Adriano had predicted, and 3 of the subsequent months were spent in the specific grinding work of dismantling things that had been built to resist dismantling: legal structures, territorial arrangements, financial instruments that had been constructed across decades by people who were very good at making things difficult to move. Marco worked 18-hour days. The estate's security posture remained elevated. There were 2 attempts, both quickly neutralized, by parties connected to networks that Caruso had imperfectly severed from. Bianca left for Europe in December. She did not say goodbye to anyone at the estate, except Mrs. Ferrante, to whom she gave a brief, genuine handshake that the older woman described to Adriano later as the most honest thing that woman ever did in this house. Adriano didn't argue with the assessment. Carlo de Luca's acknowledgement was entered into the commission record and became, in the coming year, the document around which a significant restructuring of several territorial arrangements was negotiated. He did not recover his former influence. He didn't seem to expect to. He retired to a house in Connecticut and, as far as Adriano's people could determine, spent his mornings in a garden and his afternoons being visited by his daughter, who had come back from Europe in the spring and was apparently learning, by some accounting that was entirely her own, what to build from a life that had been partially constructed on ground that turned out not to belong to her. Adriano had not spoken to Bianca since December. He thought of her occasionally, without anger, which surprised him. He thought that people were mostly what their circumstances made them, and that the interesting question was always what they did when they found out the circumstances weren't what they'd been told. The East Wing Music Conservatory opened in the spring. It had been Adriano's grandmother's parlor once, and then a storage space, and then nothing for 11 years. And now it had new floors and acoustic paneling and 12 small practice rooms off a central hall that could hold 40 children when the chairs were arranged correctly, which they were on the first Saturday of May when the inaugural youth program brought in its first cohort. Elena was not there as an employee of the estate. She was there as the youth vocal program director, contracted through the community foundation that Adriano had established to hold the conservatory's operating budget, a foundation with a board of independent directors, and a mandate that explicitly prevented any single individual from controlling its programming. He'd done it that way deliberately. He hadn't wanted her work to belong to him. He sat in the back of the hall on a folding chair that was slightly too small for him, in a room full of children who ranged from 8 to 15 and who were very loud and had very little patience for being arranged into rows, and he watched Elena stand at the front of the room and somehow, without raising her voice, without any visible authority except the specific gravity of someone who was entirely themselves in a room, settle them into something like order. She started them on a simple call and response, a melody he didn't recognize, something modern, accessible, built for young voices just beginning to understand what their voices could do. Then, almost as a parenthesis, she showed them another melody. Old, minor-keyed, words in a dialect most of them had never heard. She sang the first line alone. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something real is happening in them. She sang it again. She gestured. The children tried it back to her, tentative, uneven, beautiful in the particular way that unpolished things are beautiful because they are entirely without pretense. She smiled. The real one, the one that was not arranged for anyone and happened because something had arrived that deserved it. Adriano pressed his palm flat on his thigh and looked at the old melody coming out of 40 young throats in a room that used to be closed and was now open, and he breathed the kind of breath that a man breathes when he has been holding something for a very long time and has finally found the right place to put it down. After the session, when the children had filtered out in the particular noisy chaos of children released from concentrated attention, and the staff had begun stacking chairs, Elena walked to the back of the hall where he was still sitting. She looked at him, at the chair that was too small, at the way he was sitting in it without caring that it was too small. "You stayed the whole time," she said. "Yes. You didn't have to." "I know." He looked at the front of the room where the last echo of the melody was still somehow in the air. "I wanted to." She sat down in the chair beside him. Their shoulders were almost touching. She didn't move to increase or decrease the distance, and neither did he. And that particular quality of neither of them moving was its own kind of saying something. "My father wants to thank you," she said. "He's been trying to figure out how for 3 months. He doesn't have to. He knows he doesn't have to. He wants to." She paused. "He said he wants to cook for you. He said it's the only language he has that's big enough." Adriano looked at his hands. "Tell him yes," he said. She nodded. The last chair was stacked. The last staff member left, pulling the door almost but not entirely closed behind them, leaving the hall in the particular quiet of a space that has just held something and is still holding its shape. "No one ever impressed me," Adriano said. He hadn't planned to say it out loud. It arrived in the room the way the old melody arrived in the East Corridor that first Tuesday morning, not from a decision, but from something older than decisions. For 10 years, everyone who tried, they were all trying to become something, some version of what they thought I wanted. He looked at her. "You never tried." "I didn't know who you were," she said. "That first morning." "I know." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot, whether it would have been different if you'd known." She considered it, honestly, without rushing it. "I think I would have been more careful," she said. "I wouldn't have said the mansion felt lonely. I wouldn't have told you to eat." A pause. "I probably wouldn't have sung." "Then I'm glad you didn't know," he said. She turned to look at him, at this man who ran one of the most complicated operations in the Northeast, who had negotiated with killers and dismantled structures that had stood for decades, who had stood in a doorway every morning for a month drinking coffee and listening to her sing like a person who had finally found the frequency their ears had always been tuned for. She reached over. She put her hand over his, not reaching for anything, not signaling anything, just the simple, deliberate weight of one person's hand on another's. In the way that some gestures mean more than the words that have been built to carry meaning, because the body sometimes knows what to say when the vocabulary runs out. Outside, through the conservatory's windows, the spring light was doing what spring light does in the late afternoon, going long and warm and generous across everything, making the grounds look like a place that had always intended to become what it was currently becoming. Inside the hall, the old melody was still in the air, not audible, not exactly, but present the way things are present when they've been spoken by enough voices in enough years and have become part of the material of a room rather than just a sound that passed through it. Adriano looked at the window, at the light, at their reflection in the glass. 2 people sitting side by side on chairs that were slightly too small, in a room that used to be closed, in a house that used to run on fear. He didn't ask her to sing. He didn't need to. She was already humming, low and quiet, without thinking about it, the way people do when they are entirely themselves in a place that finally feels like somewhere they're allowed to be. He turned his hand over under hers. He held on. The feared man who had rejected the world's most beautiful women and the quiet maid who had never tried to impress him sat together in the amber light, while the old melody moved through the air around them, and the house that had learned to hold laughter began, in the patient way that honest things begin, to do exactly that.